Some of the worst housing projects in the United States have become true symbols of abandonment and danger. Imagine living in a place where the infrastructure is in ruins, security is practically non-existent, and the fear of violence is constant. Unfortunately, for many communities, this was a daily reality. Today, we will explore these places and understand how these failures affected thousands of lives and why these projects went down in history for the worst reasons. Some of these projects have been renovated, others demolished, but their history still holds important lessons about housing and inequality. Understanding what went wrong can help us prevent similar problems from happening again. So take advantage and leave your like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any more videos like this. Also share with anyone you think needs to understand more about this topic. Housing projects in the United States, known as public housing, emerged with the intention of offering affordable housing for low-income families. The idea was simple: to provide decent housing for those who were unable to pay the market value for properties. These projects were created mainly from the 1930s onwards, as part of government policies to combat urban poverty and provide relief to the most vulnerable communities. Despite good intentions, many of these housing projects have faced serious problems over the years. Lack of maintenance, which resulted in deteriorated buildings. Extreme poverty, which contributed to the social and economic isolation of communities. And unfortunately, in many cases, high crime rates. Another factor that worsened the situation was government negligence. Many of these projects were left aside, without receiving the necessary investments and care to improve the quality of life of residents. The result: housing complexes that have become problem areas, and in some cases, symbols of the failure of housing policies. 1. Cabrini Green, Chicago, Illinois. Cabrini Green was built in 1942, initially as a housing complex for World War II veterans and their families, later expanding to include a large number of low-income families. Located on Chicago's north side, it was part of a broader government effort to provide affordable post-war housing. In its initial phase, Cabrini Green was seen as a promising project, offering a solution to the housing problem in a rapidly growing city. Over the years, however, Cabrini Green quickly turned into one of the most infamous housing projects in the United States. The problems began with the lack of adequate maintenance and the deterioration of infrastructure, which resulted in buildings in poor condition, infested with rats, trash, and without effective security systems. Over time, Cabrini Green became a stronghold of violent gangs and high crime rates, with an alarming rate of murders and drug trafficking. Government negligence has only made the situation worse, leaving residents trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence. Many former Cabrini Green residents reported feeling abandoned and constantly afraid. In an interview, one resident said, "Living here was like being in a war zone. We knew we could hear gunshots at any time of the day, and we didn't even think about letting the kids play outside." Another former resident described the complex as a place where the government put people and then forgot they were there. The complex also became part of popular culture. It served as the setting for the horror film Candyman, which explored the idea of a place taken over by fear and crime, reinforcing the project's negative image. Cabrini Green deserves its place on this list because it has become the most famous example of how a housing project can tragically fail due to mismanagement, lack of investment, and government neglect. The complex was largely demolished between the 1990s and 2000s, and today the area is being revitalized with new developments. Yet her story remains a reminder of the consequences of leaving a community on the sidelines. 2. Pruitt-Igoe, ST. Louis, Missouri. Pruitt-Igoe was built in the early 1950s as part of a major urbanization effort in St. Louis. The project was designed to house a growing population and solve the housing problem in overcrowded areas of the city. It was made up of 33 buildings of 11 stories each, with the goal of providing affordable housing for African American and white families. However, racial segregation ultimately resulted in the majority of residents being from the African American community, and the dream of a modern housing solution quickly faded. Pruitt-Igoe is often remembered as one of the biggest failures in the history of U.S. public housing. Several factors contributed to the project's collapse: lack of maintenance, budget cuts, and poor management from the beginning. The deterioration of the buildings was rapid, with elevators often broken, corridors dark, and rubbish accumulating. Furthermore, residents faced extremely precarious living conditions, which led to a significant increase in crime. The deindustrialization of the city of St. Louis made the situation worse, with the loss of factory jobs. Economic isolation left many families in extreme poverty, and the project's vacancy rate increased dramatically. The lack of security made Pruitt-Igoe a dangerous environment environment, and the buildings became the scene of vandalism and gangs. Residents' accounts describe Pruitigo as a place where abandonment and despair were visible daily. In an interview, a former resident commented, "It was like no one cared. The government built these buildings and simply left us to our own devices." There was no hope of improvement. In 1972, an architect who had participated in the project, Minoru Yamasaki, declared, "Pruitigo was a painful experience. We believed that architecture could improve society, but we discovered that design alone is not enough." Pruitigo is widely considered the greatest example of urban planning failure in the US. Within less than 20 years, the buildings were deemed uninhabitable, and in 1972, the government ordered the demolition of Pruitigo. Today, the site remains empty, but the story of this project is often used as a lesson in how poorly planned policies and a lack of proper management can turn a housing solution into a social disaster. Pruitigo earns its place on the list because it was one of the most dramatic public housing collapses ever seen. Number 3. Robert Taylor Homes. Chicago, Illinois. Robert Taylor Homes, located in South Chicago, was the largest public housing project in the United States when it was built, housing more than 27,000 people in its 28 buildings. Created in the 1960s, the aim was to provide affordable housing for low-income families in one of the poorest areas of the city. However, it quickly became one of the most tragic examples of housing failure. Robert Taylor Homes' problems were largely related to a lack of adequate infrastructure and security. The towers deteriorated rapidly, and living conditions for residents were extremely challenging. Over time, the project became known for high levels of crime, with gangs controlling many of the common areas and drug trafficking becoming a constant. Furthermore, negligence on the part of the government and lack of investment and maintenance made the buildings practically uninhabitable. The social and economic isolation of residents was also a major concern. Many residents were trapped in a cycle of poverty without adequate access to jobs or essential public services. Over time, rates of violence at Robert Taylor Homes became alarming, placing the complex among the most dangerous places in the city. The place's reputation has made it the target of several demolition and revitalization initiatives over the years. Between the 1990s and 2007, the Robert Taylor Homes towers were progressively demolished as part of a Chicago redevelopment plan. Today, the site has been transformed into a mixed housing complex, but the memory of what was Robert Taylor Homes is still a stain on Chicago's public housing history. Number 4. Jordan Downs. Los Angeles, California. Jordan Downs is one of Los Angeles' best-known and oldest housing projects, located in the Watts neighborhood. Built in the 1940s, it was initially intended to house war industry workers, but over the decades it became a symbol of the challenges faced by marginalized communities. In the 80s and 90s, Jordan Downs went through periods of great violence and social unrest. The area was dominated by gangs, and drug trafficking was common, which made the environment dangerous for residents. With few economic opportunities and a lack of quality public services, many residents lived in conditions of extreme poverty, without adequate access to education, healthcare, or transportation. Despite efforts to revitalize the site, Jordan Downs continued to be a problem area for many years. However, in recent times, the city of Los Angeles has implemented urbanization plans, seeking to transform the project into a mixed housing complex with commercial spaces and better infrastructure. This revitalization attempt is seen as an effort to break the cycle of poverty and improve the community's living conditions. Even with new revitalization projects, Jordan Downs is still remembered for its tumultuous past and the challenges its residents faced throughout the years. Decades, consolidating its place on the list of the worst housing projects in the United States. Number 5. Magnolia Projects. New Orleans, Louisiana. Located in New Orleans, Magnolia Projects, also known as C.J. Peet Projects, was one of the city's largest and most notorious housing complexes. Built in 1941, the project was created to house low-income families, but over time it transformed into an area marked by extreme poverty and violence. In the 80s and 90s, Magnolia Projects gained notoriety for high crime rates, especially the presence of gangs and drug trafficking. The lack of maintenance and investment caused the complex to deteriorate rapidly, with living conditions increasingly difficult for residents. Decaying infrastructure coupled with local government neglect has made the Magnolia Projects one of the most dangerous and problematic sites in New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 brought additional devastation to the area, destroying much of what remained of the complex. After the disaster, the government decided to demolish the Magnolia Projects as part of a plan to rebuild rebuild and revitalize the city. New mixed housing complexes have emerged in their place in an attempt to create a more stable and safe community. Despite the attempted renovation, Magnolia Project's story is a reflection of the challenges faced by low-income communities in neglected urban areas, cementing its place on the list of the worst housing projects in the United States. Number 6. Queensbridge Houses. Queens, New York. Queensbridge Houses, located in the neighborhood of Long Island City, Queens, is the largest housing project in the United States, with more than 3,000 housing units. Built in 1939, the project was designed to provide affordable housing for low-income families. But over the decades, it has faced a series of challenges that have turned it into one of the most troubled places in New York. During the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Queensbridge Houses became known for high rates of violence and crime. The area was dominated by gangs and drug trafficking was constant. Tensions between residents and the police increased, leading to distrust and a cycle of violence. Furthermore, the lack of maintenance contributed to the degradation of buildings and common areas, making living conditions extremely difficult. Although New York City has implemented several revitalization programs in recent years, including infrastructure and security improvements, Queensbridge Houses still carries a reputation as an area with profound social challenges. Social assistance programs and initiatives to provide educational and employment opportunities have been implemented, but the scars left by decades of neglect are still visible. Due to its size and historical problems with crime and poverty, Queensbridge Houses deserves a place on this list, being a classic example of the challenges faced by large housing projects in the United States. Number 7. Nickerson Gardens. Los Angeles, California. Nickerson Gardens is the largest public housing project in Los Angeles, located in the Watts neighborhood. Built in 1955, it was designed to house low-income families, but it soon became synonymous with poverty, violence, and social exclusion. During the 80s and 90s, Nickerson Gardens was devastated by drug trafficking and gang violence, becoming one of the most dangerous areas in the city. High crime rates, combined with government negligence, have created an unsafe environment where shootings and violent crimes have become part of everyday life. Gangs often fought for control of the complex's streets and buildings, which further aggravated the situation for residents. Another major problem with Nickerson Gardens was the lack of economic opportunities. The high unemployment rate and economic isolation of the area made it difficult for residents to access quality jobs and services, perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Currently, there are revitalization efforts and social projects that seek to change the reality of the place, but the stigma associated with Nickerson Gardens and its history of violence is still very present. The complex continues to be a symbol of the challenges faced by low-income communities in large American cities. Due to its past marked by violence, exclusion, and neglect, Nickerson Gardens is firmly among the worst housing projects in the United States. Number 8. Brewster Douglas Housing Projects. Detroit, Michigan. The Brewster Douglas Housing Projects, located in Detroit, was one of the city's largest and best-known public housing complexes. Built in the 1930s as part of a national effort to provide housing to low-income families, the complex initially offered hope to many people, including the African American community, which faced segregation and poverty in much of the city. However, over time, Brewster Douglas fell into decline. In the 1960s, the lack of maintenance and investment began to seriously affect residents' quality of life. The complex, which was initially seen as a solution to the housing crisis, soon became a place marked by extreme poverty and violence. As Detroit's economy collapsed, particularly with the decline of the automobile industry, many residents lost their jobs, leading to an increase in crime and social unrest. In the 1970s and 1980s, Brewster Douglas became known for being one of Detroit's most dangerous spots, with gangs dominating the complex and drug trafficking becoming a prevalent activity. Abandonment by the local government also contributed to increased insecurity and deterioration of buildings. After decades of neglect, the complex was finally vacated in the 1990s, and most of the towers were demolished between 2013 and 2014. Although the site has undergone revitalization plans, Brewster Douglas's legacy is still a reminder of the failure of public housing policies in adequately addressing the needs of low-income communities. Number 9. Marcy Projects. Brooklyn, New York. Marcy Projects, located in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn, is one of New York's best-known housing projects, both for its history and notoriety. Built in the 1940s, the complex was created to provide housing for low-income families, but it soon became synonymous with crime and poverty. During the 80s and 90s, Marcy Projects was severely affected by drug trafficking and gang violence that controlled many areas of the complex. The lack of economic opportunities, combined with social disruption, made life extremely difficult for residents. Many young people grew up in hostile environments, and the lack of access to quality education and jobs perpetuated the cycle of poverty. Furthermore, government negligence and lack of investment in the maintenance of buildings and infrastructure have contributed to the decline in living conditions. The complex became a dangerous place where residents face not only precariousness, but also the constant fear of violence. Marcy Projects is also known in popular culture as it was where rapper Jay-Z grew up. He frequently mentioned the complex in his songs, using his experience to highlight the difficulties he faced and the harsh realities of marginalized communities. Despite some attempts at revitalization and improvements, Marcy Projects continues to be a symbol of the challenges faced by housing projects in New York, mainly due to the history of violence and residents' daily struggle to overcome adversity. Number 10. Red Hook Houses. Brooklyn, New York. Red Hook Houses, located in Red Hook, Brooklyn, is one of the largest housing complexes in New York and also one of the most problematic. Built in the 1930s as part of the city's public housing program, the complex was created to provide affordable housing for low-income families. However, over time, Red Hook houses came to be associated with high levels of poverty, violence, and government neglect. In the 70s and 80s, the Red Hook area became one of the most dangerous in New York. The geographical isolation of the neighborhood, due to the lack of efficient public transport, contributed to the marginalization of residents. Crime has increased dramatically and drug trafficking has become a constant concern. Residents face daily gang violence, in addition to living in precarious infrastructure conditions, with poorly maintained buildings and little security. Another aggravating factor was the area's vulnerability to natural disasters. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy caused extensive damage to the complex, leaving many residents without electricity and water for weeks. The government's slow response to the crisis further highlighted the difficult conditions in which residents lived. Despite recent revitalization efforts and infrastructure improvements, Red Hook Houses still faces many challenges, and its history of social isolation, violence, and neglect places the complex among the worst housing projects in the United States. Throughout this list of the 10 worst housing projects in the United States, some recurring themes clearly emerged. High crime, especially related to drug trafficking and gang violence, was a constant problem that haunted many of these complexes. Government negligence also stood out as a crucial factor, as the lack of investment and adequate maintenance of buildings turned these areas into almost uninhabitable places. The social and economic isolation of residents, worsened by the lack of access to public services and employment opportunities, perpetuated a cycle of poverty and violence in many of these projects. The consequences of these problems are long-lasting. Entire communities were marked by violence and abandonment, and many residents were trapped in a cycle of poverty that spanned generations. The lack of basic infrastructure, such as schools and health services, has seriously affected the quality of life, especially for children who grew up in these environments. Furthermore, the stigmatization of residents of these housing projects has created social and economic barriers that hinder the advancement of these communities. These projects, despite starting with good intentions, became a warning about failures in the formulation and execution of housing policies. In recent years, several initiatives have been taken to try to correct the mistakes of the past. In many of the complexes mentioned, revitalization projects have been initiated, replacing old deteriorated buildings with mixed housing that combines affordable units with market housing. Additionally, resettlement programs were created to relocate residents and offer better living conditions. Investments in affordable housing and social infrastructure, such as schools, health centers, and community spaces, are also being made to help rebuild these communities. Despite the challenges, these solutions show that there is an ongoing effort to ensure that the mistakes made with these projects are not repeated in the future. Thank you for following this video until the end. Discussing housing issues is fundamental to understanding the challenges that so many communities face today. These housing projects show us how poorly implemented policies can affect generations and give us the opportunity to think about fairer and more effective solutions for the future. If you liked the content, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any more videos like this. And comment below, do you know of other housing projects that should be on this list? Or perhaps you have a personal experience you would like to share? We're curious to know.